everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Middlebury Studio School's new home on 4th Street. We're so excited to be able to welcome you in the door. I'm glad that you all got to walk around and get excited about the new spaces. It's looking a lot brighter, painted with the floors. It takes a little bit of imagination still with the, railing in progress and sawdust, but you're artists, so you can envision it. We will be moving in just the next couple weeks and starting our summer camp programming here on June 23rd. So just right around the corner, we're going to start filling this place with artists and can't wait to see what happens. So it's really fun to be able to welcome people in with this series. We're calling it Chat with an Artist. Bob Green is joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Bob. It's a part of a workshop that Bob has been doing this weekend, sticking it out through the rain, doing Raku and alternative firing outside. So it's been a long day, so I really appreciate you coming to speak with us all tonight. And before I turn it over to Bob and Kathy, I just want to announce that our next chat in the series is with Kelly Hickey, who is here. And we'll be doing that at 5:30 on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, so in just a few days. And thank you all, and I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you.
So we didn't rehearse anything, but I have some facts to tell you about Bob. And he got his MFA, correct me if I'm wrong, at Southern Illinois University in ceramics. And from there, he went to New York City and worked in a cooperative in Manhattan. And
what years are we talking about? I graduated with an MFA in 1976. And then actually spent a year with a fellow named Jonathan Kaplan, helping him build a studio in Bowmansville, Pennsylvania, which is in the middle of Dutch Amish country. And he bought an old cigar factory, which we were refurbishing and making into a pottery. So I did that for a portion of the year, but while I was there, I started, this is off script, but I started teaching classes at the Spanish American Association in Lancaster.
That's where I was born. Maybe I knew you then. Oh, sorry.
And it was a community center. Hispanic kids would come and do art kind of things, and I got them to buy a kick wheel. And we would work every afternoon in the pottery studio, and on Fridays they would all the kids would pile in my truck and we'd go to McDonald's. That was the incentive for going to class, I think.
that's great.
And then I did go to New York and did join a pottery co-op.
Which one?
It was called Downtown Potters, and it was on Mercer Street in Soho. And I think there were about 5 or 6 other members. You paid a fee, and it gave you this space and kilns, but it was all electric fired stuff. What else? It's a very interesting time to be in Soho, kind of lively. A lot of artists were living in the area, and things were really transitioning from factories to artist lofts. And one of the things I did to support myself is I did art moving for people because I had this pickup truck. And I would move large canvases that people would order from a friend of mine who would put them together, but nobody had a way of getting them to their studio, so I would drive them. And occasionally I would move a piece to a museum. I moved a piece by, I can't remember who at the time, but to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, piece of sculpture. And then, basically would do this art moving stuff. And the same fellow who's building these stretchers for canvases started putting in spiral staircases in lofts. So I would move the staircases, which came in sections.
So you could fit stuff up the stairs.
So you could go and have a second
Imagine
floor.
you had to take the stairs out so you could put something upstairs. That would be odd one.
But by meeting him, I ended up getting byproduct of the wood that he was using to fire my pots, which I would fire at Battery Park on weekends. So I would load my pickup truck up with pots, go down to Battery Park on a Sunday, build a bonfire on the beach. I don't know if you guys remember, the West Side Highway was defunct at that point, and the only people that were really down there were kind of homeless people wandering around and artists that were doing projects. So I'd build these firings, and I could leave them actually for the entire day, come back and get the pots.
Interesting combo, derelict and artist.
Yeah.
Don't they go together?
How long were you in New York?
I think I was there for about 4 years, and I remember I lived on Thompson Street, then Broome Street, and then eventually I lived on the Bowery. A buddy of mine had a pottery called Good Earth Pottery, and I rented his loft because he was living somewhere else, but I slept there, and he had a pottery studio and, was making pots periodically. And I remember he and I would often do things for people in the neighborhood who were artists, like put in water heaters and things like that were really, manual, mundane, seemingly stuff to do, but it was a way to make a living, right.
Did you become known as Bowery Bob?
I didn't, but I remember my father dropping me off at my apartment, and I had to physically move a guy from in front of my doorway who was, passed out. And I remember him saying to me, I can't tell your mother this. But that was kind of the neighborhood. And, I felt it was a safe place for me. Again, I could park my truck actually on the street around there. And I lived there again for about a year.
And then Vermont.
And then Vermont.
Quite a change.
It was a great change, and I went up to Bennington. My brother had was going to school at Bennington, and the person one of the people that were teaching ceramics at Bennington, a woman named Jane Abersall, had gone to graduate school with someone who I had worked with in graduate school. So her graduate school experience. So we had a mutual friend. And I went up for the summer. They had a program called Summer 6, where they invited artists up from New York City to work in their studios, and students could observe you working. So I spent the summer up there, and it was great. I could fire my pots not on Bowery Park, but right outside Bowery, down in Lower Manhattan, but I could fire them right outside of my studio in Vermont, which was,
That must have made a big difference.
was very comfortable and freeing in a way. So at the end of the summer, I was asked or invited by Jane to be the studio tech at Bennington. And I thought it was going to be a one semester position. It lasted for 4 years.
Great.
So during that time, I really matriculated from living in the city to living in Vermont. And it kind of, made me make different kind of work and fire pieces a little bit differently. So.
And then should we go on to the present day, or do you want to?
I think I should probably show some images.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
What brought you to Frog Hollow as resident potter?
I spent 4 years at Bennington as a tech, and it was they decided it was going to be a 4-year rotating position. So after me, another young artist, relatively young artist, was going to come in and do basically what I did, which was order materials, and I was in charge of work-study students. So you would work with Bennington College students who were getting financial aid, and you would figure out different chores for them to do in and around the studio. So that was, you know.
But what brought you to Frog Hollow? What brought you to
So the
Middlebury?
four-year stint ended up, and I wanted to stay in Vermont. And there was a position at Frog Hollow opening up, and I think I interviewed, and Mr. Bob Compton might have been on the board at that time.
I didn't want to hear. I was. That was like 85.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So I came up and interviewed for this position at Frog Hollow, and you know, I felt like Middlebury was really a nice environment, and it was great.
Still is.
Still is, right? Yeah, I feel that way also.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you came.
Yeah. So it was great. I mean, you know, for me, it was important to have a certain kind of lifestyle and feel comfortable where I was living, as far as socially and politically. I felt like Vermont was more to my nature and, you know, kind of beliefs. So it seemed like a good, comfortable fit.
Well, I came from New Jersey, so I know what you're saying.
But then also, you went to Shelburne Craft School. too.
Yes, after 2 stints as I became the resident potter at Frog Hollow, which were 2, again, 4-year stints. I did 2 4-year stints. And then, you know, I went to the Shelburne Craft School with 2 other potters, Mark Simonitis and Kate Tremble. Kate was a Middlebury College student who actually had taken classes with me while at Middlebury and got credit through as an anthropology student towards her matriculating through Middlebury. So Kate graduated from Middlebury, and Kate, Mark, and I went to the Shelburne Craft School, which had pretty much become defunct. And we told them that we would put some of our money, I think we put $1,500 in a piece, and we refurbished the ceramic studio there. We bought an electric kiln, we insulated the studio, and started teaching classes.
Oh, that is, I didn't know that. That's
Elizabeth Billings was the director. And you know Elizabeth, she's a fiber artist. But she was very supportive of what we were trying to do, and you know, helped us. We taught children's classes, we taught adult classes, and yeah. So part of it for me was wanting to stay in Vermont, and part of it was wanting a place to work where, you know, we could make pots, and it was great working with Mark and Kate. You know, we were friendly with each other.
It's great.
And if you're all really good, he has a joke by his story. At the end, but
At the end.
So did you, Bob and Bob, ever work together directly?
No, no. I think we did some Raku together.
Probably, yeah. But he lived in Bristol too. For a while.
Yeah, I was living in Middlebury and then moved to Bristol. So,
Did you fire her for these things?
no,
No.
no. We used to do Raku firings in Frog Hollow in the driveway next to what is now Edgewater Gallery. We used to bring a 55-gallon drum out that was lined with fiber, and we would set up a burner and we'd Raku fire. And this 55-gallon drum, to get the pots out, we had to lift the drum up. So there were handles on either side, and you and another person lifted this drum up, and the pots would sit there glowing, and then we'd pluck them out and reduce them in wood chips and whatever, and yeah, it was great.
Did the fire department ever come?
The fire department never came. I mean, it was, wonderful. No. And then I used to pit fire work, do similar firing to what we're going to be doing tomorrow on the side of the building. So below in that little park area, I built a pit that was adjacent to a brick wall of the existing garage, which was turned into a kiln space.
Sarah wouldn't have let me do that.
Probably not. But let me show you some pots and talk about them and time period. This is not one of mine, but this is one of the early. This is a Minoan pot. It's terra sigillata, which is a clay slip rather than a glaze, and it's decorated and probably fired in a kind of bonfire firing, which is what we're doing. So this is pre-glaze technology. This little pot, it's probably about 6 inches high. And this pot is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So it's this sweet shape, and it reminds me, I think, of, somewhat of a bird shape. And I like, the whole idea of the handle and the shape of the pot in general. But these vessels were used, but they weren't very, as we think of things, being functional. Again, they were sealed with clay slip rather than a glaze. So they would be used, they were probably fired to a little bit above 1,000 degrees to make them strong enough to hold liquid, but over a period of time they would wear, break down, whatever.
Sorry, is the black and the red, are those stains?
It's probably different colored
Slip?
slips that were made. And I don't know exactly, the clay color was probably somewhat of a terracotta. And you could see closely, if you look, that there is some kind of terracotta looking. So if you can imagine, it was decorated, and where it's white was probably, some kind of titanium type thing brushed on. But it's the same clay, similar slip to what we're using. So I became interested in the surface of these pots. This is a Greek pot, 4th and 5th century BC. These pots are not glazed. They're again covered with a clay slip called terra sigillata, which means to seal with earth or earth seal. They are made by some person, and another person did the decorating or did the painting on the surface. The black is from carbon of the firing. So the pot is this kind of terracotta colored clay, and the clay slip that they used was a similar terracotta colored, but was brushed on the pot, and then part of it was removed. And where it's black is where there was a heavier buildup of the slip. So if you can imagine that somebody carefully carved away or scraped away the surface and left this decoration. And the nature of the terra sigillata absorbs anything carbonous. So when these pots were fired, the thicker areas absorbed more carbon, making them quite black. So I saw a show, these are called Homeric pottery because they're from the time of Homer. They had a show of these pots at the Dartmouth Museum, and they were pots that didn't really make it through the firing. So they weren't black and orange, they were kind of like ghost images. So you could see where the smoke had somewhat permeated the surface, and you could kind of see a figure, but they were somewhat disappearing. Very romantic looking pieces. But you can imagine that, the pots that we see in museums are the keepers, right? The successful ones, the ones that were used as trophies for Olympic prowess, They were used as some kind of monetary fund. You didn't see the broken ones or the ones where the firings didn't come out.
So you said there were a lot of failures, but.
There were a lot of failures, but like most art, you mostly see the pieces that were most successful.
Perfect, sure. Right.
I'm going to go back to this for a moment. So the surface of these pots were something that intrigued me when I was in graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, I was doing high-fired salt glaze pottery, stoneware, and I didn't really like, there was something I liked about the surface, but there was something for me that was missing in the surface, and I liked the surface of these, which was somewhat shiny, but not as shiny as a glaze. So this became something that I pursued as a graduate student, this stuff called terra sigillata. And again, I had one instructor who said, well, you make terra sigillata by throwing some calgon in a bucket of water and you mix some clay with it, and it makes this very fine clay slip. And then I had another instructor who said, no, you gotta measure everything out very carefully to make this slip and make it work. So I absorbed the second one and became really careful about mixing my terra sigillata. This is not a piece of mine either. This is a piece by Val Cushing. I show it because, again, it's another piece that I kind of like. I think this is probably from a piece from the 70s or thereabouts. It's stoneware. I think one of the things I like about it is because it talks about relationship to gravity. And for me, this became a real way of thinking about pottery, that it wasn't just utilitarian, it had to do with an object's relationship to gravity and space. So I started thinking about my pots more of this sculptural way rather than how utilitarian or what is the useful nature of these pieces. So this is one of my salt glaze pieces, a cover jar, but you can see I'm trying to get this impression of this top or cap lid pushing down on the surface and pushing out the bottom. So I'm trying to think about this interaction of gravity, how gravity affects us, how it affects something sitting in space.
Excuse me, how tall is that?
You know, I think these were about 14 inches in diameter by, it's a pretty decent size. So 14 by maybe 14, thereabouts. Again, they were just covered forms.
It's two different pieces, right?
They're two different sections, right. And again, the top section was meant to be somewhat more angular and give you this, again, sense of pushing down. So I think I was inspired by Val Cushing's kind of shapes and trying to integrate that into my own work. This is a salt glaze piece as well, and it's thrown symmetrically, but then, you know, I had the nerve to kind of distort it with my fingers because it was kind of a thing you played around with doing as a graduate student. And, you know, I think some of it was I had been inspired by somebody like Peter Volkus, who's a somewhat famous ceramic artist, but he was someone who took functional work and kind of changed it for himself and made it much more of what he considered and I considered an art form, where it wasn't so much needing to be symmetrical, but how could he instill his own personal self into this clay vessel. My final graduate work were these pieces, which were about 24 inches in diameter. They're porcelain and they're covered with terra sigillata, and I did a room full of these shapes. And very stark. They were shown on pedestals that I had built out of wood that were 4x4s. And, you know, it's just a room full of these different stacked forms. They came apart. So in theory, they were cover jars, but it's mostly thinking about, again, this idea of gravity and pushing down. They were also, for me, very figurative in a way. And the terra sigillata, I think if you look at my pieces, to me, they're somewhat like human flesh. They're shiny, they have a sheen to them, but they're not really glossy. So for me, it had to do with sensuality, and again, this human anatomy. Battery Park. This is same terra sigillata, only it's a red terra sigillata that I started using and playing around with the idea and thinking about the Greek pots that I so admired. How could I control the black surface on the pots? So these are, again, this is a pretty good sized pot. It's wheel thrown, and what I did was mask off areas with aluminum foil and masking tape or drafting tape. So I would make the pot, burnish it, fire it, and then before I'd fire it in wood, I would cover it with aluminum foil and tape and try and create these patterns. And wherever there was aluminum foil, it would keep the pot black. And, keep the pot orange. And wherever it was exposed, the pot would become black. So I was trying to think of how I break up the surface of the pot with carbon. So this is all black from smoke. So it was somewhat controllable, somewhat ethereal. It's kind of a large platter with that same idea of trying to control this coloration by using aluminum foil. And I think at some point I started painting the orange terra sigillata with a red and a blue or silver looking terra sigillata, and that's what you're seeing underneath with these squiggly lines. And then I would mask over them again with all of this aluminum foil. So all of this preparation would take me, I don't know, and I'd spend a day doing several of these, but I'd take them down to Battery Park or wherever and build a bonfire with all of these things that were covered with aluminum foil. And wherever it smoked, you would get black, and wherever it was protected, you would keep this orangey coloration. Again, these are all coming from these Greek and Roman pots. This is the pot that Wayne Higby mentioned. I applied to a show in San Francisco, and Wayne Higby, who's a ceramic artist, was the juror for the show, and he wrote something in the catalog that he was really interested in seeing this pot. And I didn't even read the brochure. My brother did. And he said, your pot is mentioned in this brochure. And it's this idea of masking off and trying to control this firing technique. Wayne Higby was known for Raku firing. So this wasn't Raku, but again, it's this terra sigillata doing what we would call primitive firing. You can see the marks, right, of the tape marks. So for me, it was kind of integrated into the shape of the pot, or at least that's what my goal was. Ooh. Yeah, so this was a bit of a departure. I think this was, more a Bennington period where I started doing the same terra sigillata white, but then I'd go back over and paint different colored terra sigillatas over the piece. There's a blue and a red terra sigillata and a black at the very top. And then part of it was glazed with a white crackle glaze. So the center area where it's white was actually glazed. Then the whole thing, after it was glaze fired, was fired in wood. So the smoke that you see is permeating the part that was not glazed.
So it was high fired first?
It's not. It's still a low fire glaze. It's like a Raku fired glaze without. I fired it first in an electric kiln just to melt the glaze. And then I fired it again in wood just to get the smoke or the gray areas. During this period of time at Bennington, outside of my studio, there were paper wasps nests. And I remember seeing them, you know, kind of this variegated shape in the crotch of the building or something like that. So I started making these pots and covering them with a porcelain slip. But the inspiration was watching these wasp nests. And the pot is thrown, and while it's still quite damp, I applied this very thick slip that would actually adhere to the surface of the pot. And once it was bisque fired, it became strong, like the surface of the pot. Then I started Raku firing them. So some of you guys have done Raku today. You can see the variation in, you know, this is one glaze, and the color has shifted because part of the pot was covered with wood chips and part of it was exposed to the air or elements. Where it's blue, it's exposed to the air, and where it's kind of metallic, it was covered with wood. That's called reduction. What we did today in our class is we did these kind of firings where you played around with having reduction on pieces and then exposing pieces to the air and trying to control this kind of uncontrollable formulation of chemistry in a way.
Mystery.
Right. So the tricky part was applying the slip. You would throw the pot, and while the pot was still quite wet, to get the slip to adhere, you had to apply it to a quite damp or wet pot. And very often you would apply it and the pot would collapse from the weight of the slip. But if you could get it just right, once you bisque fired it, it became strong with the pot. So this is, again, a Raku glaze that we use today that I started playing around with.
How large is that?
I think that was about 9 inches. The other one, the one with the long neck, that was quite tall, and it was made in sections that were thrown onto each other, if that makes sense.
Quite tall, like how tall?
The one previously, that's probably about 20 inches.
Ooh, that's pretty.
I started pursuing Raku really seriously while I was teaching a summer program at Bennington College for high school students. And it was called the July program. And kids would come for the month of July and take 2 classes at Bennington. And if they decided to go to Bennington, they could use that credit towards matriculating at Bennington College. So I taught ceramics, and you might do ceramics and dance or something in poetry. You took 2 classes, and then the rest of the day you were free. So I remember teaching, and it was a 3-hour block of time. My students would come in and make work, and then when it come to glaze work, they would glaze pieces and then kind of disappear. Because by the time you got it fired in the gas kiln or electric kiln, they wouldn't see their work for at least 2 days or something like that. So I figured I needed to do something, and I figured I'd try Raku firing. And Raku is a 16th century Japanese firing technique which is quite fast. And it's not a very high fire technique, but you could fire a piece within a period of an hour or an hour and a half. So when I started Rakuing with my high school students, it totally changed my teaching experience. You can imagine a teenager being exposed to fire and this also immediate gratification of seeing results. So it became a very exciting experience for them, but it also got me to think about my work differently. So I started Raku firing, And this is copper matte glaze. It's a wheel-thrown piece, and the glaze is sprayed on, but this is one glaze.
Oh, really? Wow.
And what I started noticing or realizing is that all of these pieces were cooled in wood chips. And depending on how the wood chips burned would influence the color of the glaze. So again, this is many trial and error. I started playing around with dampening the wood chips. So I would take a 5-gallon bucket of cherry wood chips and I would travel around and I'd get wood chips from different furniture makers. I became friendly with Dale Helms, who's a furniture maker who lives in Bristol, but he was living in Reigate initially. And I would travel and get bags and bags of cherry wood chips from him because I knew I wanted those wood chips for my firings. So I'd fire a pot and I'd have these buckets of cherry wood chips surrounding me, and I would dampen the buckets with different amounts of water. And I would use up to 1 liter of water in a 5-gallon bucket of wood chips. So by dumping the wood chips over the pot, I would have damp, less damp, damp wood chips and making almost layers or sections. And what I realized is that areas would burn more readily than others. And in doing so, it would change the color of the glaze.
Bob, is that something that we could apply with the Raku firings in terms of the sawdust pit, and maybe have some of them more moistened and some of them drier?
You have been. Though you might not realize.
Not intentionally.
That's what I've been trying to do. The reason you're getting a crackle pattern is because of the dampening of the wood chips. So also exposing it, but I think on Catherine's piece today, the long platter that came out with this wonderful crackle pattern, it was from the dampened wood chips that really just kind of caused the surface of her glaze to crackle, but it wasn't so wet. The wood was still able to burn and smolder, and she saw the crackle pattern because of the smoke of the burning wood permeating the crackle. So it's somewhat like that. You could try it with the Hawaiian matte glaze because that's similar to what I was using. But it's tricky.
Just final question, if you put like wet chips on one side and real dry ones on the other, would you get a problem with cracking?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So there's, I think I'll tell you that when I started doing this, maybe 1 out of 6 pieces would make it. And, I found that as I did more of these and I became a better potter, if I made the pots very uniformly in thickness, I had a greater attrition rate. But even so, I think 1 out of 3 would make it through the firings. And these were pretty good size. They were about 14 inches in diameter. So I would fire a pot, and very often I'd re-glaze it and fire it again. And sometimes it would make it through the second firing, and I'd think, oh, I can do this one more time and get a little more color here, and the piece would crack. And it's one of these things, it cracks, it would just all of a sudden crack. So I don't remember how many years I did these pots for, but I love them and I love the color of them, but the color also became fugitive in that with the surface and the layers of this glaze, if they were exposed to UV light for a period of time, they would start to fade. So I would have them in Frog Hollow and they'd be in the window, and the side that was in the window after about 2 weeks would be duller in color than the side that was facing the wall. So the alternative was to spray them with something to kind of seal them, which I tried for a while, and it was just another thing, and it became too much. overbearing in process.
And wax wouldn't have,
It would change the surface. These were really this kind of weird matte and shiny surface, and by waxing them, I think you would have lost the color. It would kind of become muddier. This is a stoneware fired piece, which I did during that same period of time, and I think I gave this piece to Mark Simonitis. It's a black ash glaze pot that was stoneware fired. And this, is more to kind of where I'm at now. This is that same Raku, maybe a different glaze. I became more interested in this idea of a crackle pattern and how I might really control this crackle pattern rather than have copper, where the glaze will often shift. This is a copper glaze, so it can shift in color from this blue to more of this metallic copper color. I became more interested in the linear quality of this crackle pattern and what it would do on the surface of the pots.
I love that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, again, a wheel-thrown piece which is covered with that porcelain slip. It's altered, meaning when it was still wet, it was made more elliptical or irregular, and part of it is hand-built. So the top section is hand-built, a slab, and then the very top was a coil that was hollowed out and then cut down the center. And as it was drying, it initially, just on its own accord, separated. So I think the part of this which can be educational is the fact that the center portion of it was exposed to air, and that is what created the crackle pattern, while both sides were purposefully kept covered up with wood. And you can see the color shift, and that's chemical reaction that's happening in the glaze. What you're doing is removing oxygen molecules from the glaze and having the glaze shift from blue to red. So you have reduction and oxidation on the same pot. Again, that's again a wheel-thrown piece which has been altered. The same with that porcelain slip applied to the piece, and if you look closely, you get the sense of this slip dripping off of the surface, which is kind of what I was after, this feeling that it was still in motion, so to speak, and going to fall off of the pot. But it's fast with the pot once it was bisfired. The trick was trying to handle these things so nothing got broken while they were being taken out of the kiln. Again, this is this idea of using one glaze and varying the wood chips, the dampness of the wood chips. So I think this is really indicative of that. I started with a nest of dry wood chips, and the heat of the pot coming out of the kiln placed in the wood chips ignited the pot and the surrounding wood chips. And while it was burning, I would quickly start pouring these buckets of wood chips over the pot. And eventually the dampest bucket of wood chip would go on the top.
You had them, again, with different
Degrees of moisture. Yeah. So, literally, we're doing it by touch. I feel it and I feel it stamp. I was measuring out liters of water per bucket of, again, cherry wood chips.
And that's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about 14 by 14.
Cherry because mineral content in the wood or just hardwood?
It was just the hardwood that was readily available, and I was trying to get some kind of consistency in all of this stuff, which is pretty inconsistent. So, all of this, I think, was somewhat ridiculous in a manner because, you're dealing with something that's so ethereal, and I'm trying to figure out a way of maybe controlling it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that I did is rather than have the shape of the pots always be round, I started making pots with these architectural features or horizontal planes at the top to get the wood chips to actually sit there. So if you can imagine, these pots are very hot. You can't really touch them once you've put them down. All of these were pulled out of the kiln using my hands and gloves. Nothing was tongued because they were too fragile. So I picked them up wearing these big kind of fire mitts and place them down and then throw off the mitts and start grabbing these buckets of wood chips. So again, dry wood chips at the bottom and then damper wood chips up above. So I'd have a prepared nest to receive these pots. I didn't do many bowl or open shapes. They were hard, difficult to do. This is maybe one of, you know, I know I did several, but I think this is probably the most successful. It had a white crackle glaze on the interior. So this is more evident of that horizontal plane at the top. Back to terra sigillata. So even though this is something I did as a graduate student, this idea of burnishing or applying a clay slip to seal the surface of the pot, it's still something I'm interested in today. And this is a piece similar to maybe the work that's here now. It's wheel thrown and it's burnished, meaning hand polished, and it's first burnished with a stone and then it's burnished with this liquid clay slip, which is then polished with either a chamois. I think I was using polar fleece, which you guys all have polar fleece jackets. But you know, it's a great material if it's so synthetic. It's like plastic, right? So the more you polished it, the shinier it become. Then these were fired in wood for the black area. But what I started doing is using something called ferric chloride, which is an etchant, and it's used mostly for etching metals. But at a certain amount of heat, it will develop all of these colors, and orange, red, varied coloration. What I started doing is trying to play around with, again, this idea of black areas on the pot. The top section is covered with wood chips that is being held in place with aluminum foil. So this pot was fired while it was wrapped up with aluminum foil, and the white area is from kosher salt that was sprinkled into the wrapped pot. So again, the whole pot, when it was fired, looked completely like crumpled up aluminum foil. I make a lot of these pots with these small openings on the top, and it's somewhat in reference to Native American pots that were used for storing seeds. And Native American potters used a slip as well. They didn't call it terra sigillata. Maria Martinez refers to it as a slip, but it's the same idea of using liquid clay to seal the surface of the pottery by burnishing or polishing it. Again, this one was fired with wood, ferric chloride, kosher salt.
Delicious.
And the small opening is in reference to these Native American pots that were used for storing seeds. And the idea was that the seeds would be kept dry, but also pest-free. So you'd be able to keep the seeds for a season, and then when you go to plant, you would take the pot out into the field and shake it, and the seeds would pop out. It's, you know, just this idea of playing around with the surface and trying to break up the surface that's going to appear from the firing with these areas of black. So I'm still interested in these black areas of the pot. Again, in not even going back to the Greek and Roman pots, but it's something that left this tremendous impression on me as far as a way of breaking up the surface of the pottery with these black areas. I like these pots. I think for me, they remind me of a piece by Brancusi, the sculptor, which is called Bird in Space. And Brancusi did a series of pieces that were marble and bronze. Brancusi was an artist maybe in 1923, 1930s. He's Romanian. He's considered a modern artist, but he made these shapes that were to give you the feeling of something flying or moving through space. So these are my idea of that same kind of form, or my interpretation of that form.
How tall?
These are both about 19, 20 inches.
Pretty good size.
Yeah, they're pretty good size. Same situation, same kind of technique, burnishing, and again, wood firing. I started using some other things in the wood firing, and I don't know how present it is in this one, but I started using things like wire, and things like copper wire would actually give me a little line. So rather than have these areas of color, some of the pieces I'm doing now have actually this really fine, almost like pencil drawn line on the surface of the pot. And that's a byproduct of burning wire that's being sucked into the terra sigillata surface. Again, this terra sigillata stuff is really amazing. It tends to absorb anything carbonous burning around it. So for the Greek pots, it absorbed it and made these black figures. For me, I'm trying to just have these areas of black and coloration. These are, two pots that were somewhat similar to the shape of the pot that's here. And I was mentioning to someone that this is a shape that I saw at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of an ancient Egyptian pot that had the same kind of clay burnished surface. Only the pot that they had was completely black at the top. So my impression was that the pot was fired upside down in wood or some kind of organic material, and the black was from the burning wood, and the rest of it was kind of this orange coloration. This is just a classical shaped little pot. Everybody in my class knows this glaze at this point. This is a glaze that we've used today. This is a Raku glaze. Again, it's one glaze, and the variation of the coloration has to do with the fact that part of it got smoked and part of it was less smoked. So we use newspaper to create a smoky and non-smoky area on some of these glazes. So again, there's a chemical change that's happening in the glaze, and it has to do with the removal of oxygen from the glaze that's causing the glaze color to shift. So where it's blue, it's oxygen rich, and where it's more of the rose color or metallic coloration, it's oxygen starved or smokier. This happens very quickly. So it's almost, happening magically before your eyes. This is the same use of the terra sigillata, and it's called naked Raku. There's no glaze on the surface. It's Raku fired, and it's fired with a thick clay slip over the burnished surface. And the idea is that the thick clay slip doesn't really want to stick to your pot. So what it's trying to do is crack away. So when you're seeing the black lines, it's where the slip is peeled away from the pot, and it's allowed the smoke from the Raku firing to permeate the surface of the pot. So by your application of this thick slip, you can create this crackle pattern, which is not a glaze, but it's just a remarking or the memory of the smoke permeating the surface. The more slip, the thicker the crackle pattern. Where it's black, there was no slip, so that's raw clay. Yeah, I was talking to my friend Bob Compton, who's here, that you should keep the pots you like the best, and don't sell them. Keep them for you and your family. So I kept this one.
Good, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, I'll try and answer them.
I just wanted to say we're over time, so if you need to leave, go ahead, but can you answer a few questions?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes?
I'm not a potter, but does the type of wood that you use in the firing determine the color of the black?
Yes.
Is that why you like cherries?
Yes.
Okay.
I think if we went back to the black areas on a lot of those pots, like the tall ones, for example, when I show these images to friends that are painters, when I've taught for Mass College of Art, they always remark about the quality of the black. And there is something of the intensity and the saturation of the black, which I think has to do with the type of wood. So I do specifically use hardwoods, and I do try and use cherry, because I believe that it gives me this saturated black, which you don't know how interesting that is for people, but for someone like me, it's like, wow, this is a great color black, right? So
Have you ever found a wood that would produce a cooler black?
I'm afraid I haven't segregated it that much or gotten enough of a certain kind of wood. Like cherry is readily available. Occasionally, people used to save specific types of wood for me, some very exotic woods, but it was never enough to really get a sense of what they'll do. Like I had friends that were using babinga, these different types of more exotic woods. I've used mahogany, but again, I've used maple, oak, but purely I stay away from softwoods of any kind because they give you a creosote buildup. They don't burn cleanly. So those are, totally off for me. I kind of ignore them.
Does the size of the wood chips have been?
Yes.
I think because you have everything from sawdust to
Yes.
different sized chips.
I'm trying to use chips about the size of my pinky fingernail.
Okay, well.
And if I could get them, I'm very happy.
Yeah,
But you can't always get them. And I look at these chips when we're Raku firing. Today, Sansor and I looked at the chips, and that's what I'm looking at, the particle size of the chips. So I'm not really telling her these chips are bad or good. I'm just looking to see what size they are because I know they'll give me a different effect.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Hi, Bob. I do wood turnings, so I do cherry and maple and so
Yeah.
forth. Are those shavings a good size? I know because they burn pretty quickly because it's very dry.
I use them periodically when I teach, but I don't use them so much for my own work. Again, I try and use these more chip, like from a jointer, if I can, a planer type thing, if I could get them.
That's more like what I call shavings.
Yeah. But I have used them.
Interesting. What actually look at it.
How about the Joan Baez story?
Have to come tomorrow.
Are you guys up for this? It's quick.
Yes. Yes.
I was working at Shelburne Craft School many years ago, and there was a message on the answering machine at the Shelburne Craft School studio. Hi, this is Joan Baez. I'm looking for a place where I can decorate pottery. And there was a phone number left. And I felt like, well, this is a practical joke that one of my studio buddies is playing on me because I'm the one that's there early. I'm answering the phone. It's the end of March. I hear there's an April Fool's joke. I call the phone number, and it's a hotel in Williston. And I say, can I speak to Joan Baez? And next thing I know, I'm speaking to Joan Baez.
Oh, great. Oh.
And I say to her, well, this is a craft school. If you come here, I'll show you how to make a pot, but we don't just decorate pottery here. So about an hour later, Joan Baez shows up in a taxi. And she comes out, and I ask her if she's ever worked on the wheel, and I thought for sure somebody like Joan Baez has friends that are potters. She surely has done this before, and she never had. So we sit down at a wheel and we start very basically centering the clay and making very small pots. So this went on for the better part of the day, and at the end of the day, about 6 o'clock, she called up the cab company in Burlington, and nobody answered the phone because nobody takes a cab in Vermont. So I gave her a ride back to her hotel in Williston. I had 2 dogs, an old Saab, and the dogs are hanging all over her.
I get the feeling she's just a regular person,
Well, wait. She's humming songs.
Oh.
So we go back to Williston, I drop her off, and I say, if you want to come back, you can come back. She came back for 5 days.
Wow.
And made pots.
Did you pick her up and drive her back?
I didn't, but after I had taken her back to her hotel, her entourage showed up at the craft school asking where Joan was, and one of my students told them that she had run off with their pottery team. So at the end of the 5 days, she gave each one of the students, 37 students, tickets to her performance at the Flynn.
Wow.
And she would eat lunch with them every day and buy ice pops at the Shelburne Market. And, it was just a wonderful, marvelous, nice person.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, and
Great.
it was a great experience. And she was very lovely.
Did
Did
you
she
take
make
the
any
pots
good
with
pots?
her? Yeah.
She made pots that I actually glazed all of her pots for her, and I sent them to her while she was on tour. And I felt like she had left her tour book behind accidentally, and I looked through it where she was going to be. And it was very interesting. She had a criteria. She would only stay in hotels where she could open the windows, where there aren't many hotels where you can open the windows anymore. And there had to be a vegetarian restaurant accessible. So there were certain, things that she had. She also told me she was very concerned about the strength of her voice and how she would maintain it. That it was something that was very important, and she felt it was fleeting. So her preparation and the idea of humming was really wonderful. So
I've just always had a feeling she's a real person.
She was a real person.
Always had that feeling.
Yeah, she was great.
Well, thank you for
Thank you
sharing.
so much.
Thank you.